There's kind of this idea that the pastor is going to come in now and this mysterious, intimidating, scary book of Revelation. You can give thanks to God, congregation, that I'm here to explain to you what it means. You won't say it this way, but some of us have known about the danger of Gnosticism. Gnosticism is a Greek word on knowledge, and the idea that somehow certain people are privileged to secret knowledge, and the knowledge is the way to salvation. There's a danger in presenting the 7 sermons like, wait a minute, you poor people will never get it, but again, good thing I came along, and I'm the big revealer who will give you these truths, and you go, oh, wow. And I have the same with leading tours, it goes one step further, for those, I've been there, and I can tell you what it really means, these symbols and so forth. There's a call for humbleness here. Be careful that you don't preach or teach it in a way that your audience feels marginalized or distant,
Hey, welcome to the Expositors Collective Podcast, episode 266. I'm your host, Mike Neglia, and the voice you just heard is that of our guest for this week, Dr. Jeffrey Weima. Dr. Weima is professor of New Testament at Calvin Theological Seminary, where he has taught for the past 3 decades. He is a scholar and a very well-spoken communicator. He's able to teach in an interesting, contemporary, and practical way. He's published 6 books so far, and 5 of them have to do with the letters of the Apostle Paul. And the most recent one is, he calls it On the 7 Sermons of Jesus to the 7 churches in Revelation. Not letters, but sermons. You'll hear more about that in the interview itself. This is a book that I was reading for my own personal preparation for a teaching series that I was going through. And I was so enriched personally from the book that I wanted to try to get him on the show and have a conversation with him. Part of this is for your benefit. I think the listeners of the show need to be able to hear and learn from this man, but selfishly, mostly for my benefit. I wanted to ask specific questions and I wanted to get advice from the man himself. In this conversation, we talk about feedback, making academic study accessible to the broader church, and the chair of despair. I think that you're really going to like this one. So before we start, let me just say that registration for our next in-person training event has gone live. There'll be a link in the show notes that will take you straight to the registration page if you want to book yourself in for our 2-day Preachers Training event in Austin, Texas, June 2nd and 3rd. The early bird registration is for the whole month of March, and at $70. Then, April 1st to 15th, it goes up to $80. And then, April 15th and onwards, it goes to its full price of $90 per person. Trust me, this is an investment that will bear fruit in your life. Maybe you want to come by yourself, make some friends. Maybe you want to bring your team. If there's a women's ministry director, a youth pastor, if there's an intern, if there's anyone that you can think of who wants to grow in their personal study and public proclamation of God's word, well, come on down to Texas. I can't wait to see you there. Again, it's Austin, Texas, June 2nd and 3rd. And then for you forward planners, let me just say that we're going to be in Indiana, in the city of Indianapolis, October 27th and 28th. So Texas in June, Indiana in October. All right, here is Dr. Jeffrey Weima, from the study to the pulpit and from the academy to the pew. All right, hey, welcome to the Expositors Collective Podcast. Once again, I'm glad to have as a guest this week, Dr. Jeffrey Weima, and we're going to speak about the 7 churches of Revelation and ways to interpret and to apply this notoriously tricky book. But before that, Jeffrey, I'm not good at small talk. I'm just going to ask you straight away, what's the first time that you ever preached a sermon? And then as we hear about that, I'm sure we'll kind of get to know you a bit that way.
Well, thanks, Mike. It's a pleasure for me to talk with you and to share a little bit about at least part of what I've been doing lately, and namely looking at the book of Revelation. So going back to when I first preached, I can hardly remember. I don't think I'm that old, but I do know that before I even felt a call to ministry, the local pastor, I was involved in the youth group, asked me to speak at the local old age building. And I was the favorite preacher there, not because of the content, but because I have a loud voice. I was probably the only person they could really hear. And so I have some humbling memories about my stumbling attempt at preaching, without any training at all. And then that was part of the process that God used to, I think, instill in me a call to ministry. And then I started thinking about going to grad school, that is to get a master's of divinity, and then I finally got training. So I do kind of remember that first sermon. I was in northern Alberta. It was a very rural, but nevertheless large congregation. I think there were like 700 to 800 people, so it's pretty intimidating for the first time to preach. And what's more, not only were they a large group of people, they were unbelievably good listeners. They seem to have nothing else to do in these long winters but read books about theology, and they listen with a very critical ear. And I remember I had a sermon something like, "Are you born again?" And it doesn't sound like a very racy title, but in my circles, that wasn't the kind of language that was used. And I remember the elders afterwards give me a little bit of a hard time about that. And I tried to say, well, I thought I read that in John 3, and we have a confession in our tradition which also uses the language of being born again. But I found out quickly that preaching is difficult, nerve-wracking, and it's sometimes dangerous. And that's what we all go through. And I guess I'm quite happy to be now quite a few years removed from that. It's nice to get over those initial humps and to have a greater degree of confidence based on experience and training in preaching.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Thanks for letting us in on both of those. Curious, just personally. So they were taking you to task over what, using the language of born again, or is it because, or were you implying that there might be some unregenerate amongst the congregation? Is that it's a long time ago.
I come from a Reformed tradition, which has strengths but also weaknesses, and it's somewhat insular. And in that day, born again was language that more broadly evangelicals used. It wasn't language that those within the Reformed camp did. And so they were just maybe a little uncomfortable, and that made them a bit suspicious about this young preacher, from out of town, coming with these challenging ideas. So I felt pretty confident that what I was saying was based on Scripture, and that's an important point too. I try to encourage students. I know, of course, it's impossible not to be influenced by your audience. I mean, we all want our audience to like and respond well to what we're saying, and it'd be foolish not to have your ear to the ground. But I always think of 1 Corinthians 4, where Paul, despite being a pastor there for a year and a half, despite leading them to Christ, didn't have a good relationship with the Corinthians. And they seemed to be more impressed with Apollos, this gifted orator. And so Paul in 1 Corinthians 4 says something like, I care very little whether I'm judged by you or by any human court. It's the Lord who judges me. And he'll one day return and make clear what is in the motives of each person's heart. And so in a certain sense, pastors need to kind of close their ears to what the audience may judge positive or negative, and focus on the one person to whom they're accountable, namely the Lord Jesus Christ. And so if that's your motivation and your preaching is based on the Word, then whether people like it or not, again, there's a human need for us to be affirmed. But, there is also a danger, right, that we're always trying to win over the crowd. And even if we're successful, then we run into the danger of trying to beat ourselves. We're trying to be better than we were the week before. And so somewhere along the line, preachers need to reach a mentality of, wait a minute, I'm being faithful with the time and the talents that God has entrusted with me. I'm going to do my best in explaining the Word, and I'm going to trust that the Holy Spirit will will bear fruit, to that word. And I hope that I will be encouraged, because the same Paul says in Thessalonians, encourage each other and build each other up. So that's important too. But we shouldn't be a slave to whether or not others find us successful.
Yeah. I believe it was Spurgeon in his lectures to his students. He spoke about how every good preacher needs to have one blind eye and one deaf ear. And going to your points, the ability to some degree, tune out some kind of undue criticism, and then also to turn a blind eye to some, what's the word, like over-exaggerated praise.
Yeah. And one more point I might make, I think there's also the danger of the other extreme. I found that biblical literacy is increasingly a problem, in recent times. And then that can be dangerous too, because that means that pastors, in a sense, can get away with a lot more than they could have perhaps in the past. In other words, there aren't people there who have the biblical knowledge or the theological training to offer a helpful evaluation. And pastors should be careful not to take advantage of that either, right? So there, like a lot of things in life, right? There are dangers on the extremes, and there are also positives. So I think it's good that church was listening carefully and weren't afraid, especially the leadership, to raise some questions. But of course, it can go too far, and then there has to be a proper balance in this whole equation of the relationship between a pastor and the leadership and the congregation.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks for bringing in that counterbalance. But yeah, would that every congregation have a cold Canadian winter to go through, and nothing but theology books to keep them entertained? At least one winter like that, and then maybe a little bit broad throughout then. So how have you grown over the years? There's certainly, I'm imagining there's things that you used to do that you've intentionally stopped, or perhaps things that you've intentionally added to your preaching preparation rhythm or delivery. How have you grown over these years?
Well, one obvious thing is I've learned what things to leave behind in the study and what things to bring to the pulpit. I think at the very beginning, I had this sense that I had to explain every single word in the whole passage. And if I didn't, people would be saying to themselves, oh, he didn't say anything about that or this. And that's so far from reality. Again, I wish that people were following that closely. And what's more, that's not really a helpful way to preach, because we have that expression in English, right? You lose the forest for the trees. And if you focus too much on all those little exegetical details, I think it can become easy to lose the thrust of the passage, the main point. And so I think I've learned the hard way, right? That even though there's some good stuff, and it's hard sometimes for a pastor because you found it and you're excited about it, and plus you want to somehow show that you've been working hard at a great detail, and yet sometimes you have to say, no, I guess I should just leave that behind, and sometimes less is more, right? In the sense of being clear, because you're thinking about this passage over and over again for a long period of time, and people are only hearing it one time, kind of cold turkey. And so you have to be really, really clear and deliberate about what you want to say if you want to communicate well. So that's one, I think, principle. I've learned a lot of little things along the way. I'm not trained as a homiletician. I'm a New Testament scholar, so I'm an egghead, on academic side things, but I preach an awful lot. And one of the things that I do that most pastors don't get to do is I get to preach the same sermon over and over again. And there's something good about that. Well, at least this is how I've kind of learned. So I found when I repeated sermons, I almost found myself naturally doing certain things. And then after a while, when this happened on a number of different sermons, I started to pull back and say, now, well, why did I change it from the way that I originally did? And I could kind of discern some patterns or practices. And so that became helpful for me to kind of learn. Now, most pastors don't have that privilege, but for example, Direct discourse is a lot more lively and engaging than indirect discourse, right? I mean, it's one thing if you just said, oh, they did this and they did that, but if you can somehow put it into a first-person narrative or even a third-person narrative, but in direct discourse, somehow the text pops. It just comes alive. Also, details. I think it's good that even if you're telling a story that may not be true, that I shouldn't say that. It's true, but it's not maybe, you want to hide details in order, let's say it's a real story, but you want to hide details. I think at first I kept out names, for instance, because I didn't want, someone who maybe knew my past could maybe figure out who or what church I was talking about. But I found out afterwards that it's good to still include names. May not be the original names. You can let the audience say that. But when you mention the name of a person and the name of a place, it kind of personalizes the story. And again, it also kind of comes alive in a fresh way that I think didn't before. I think that a personal testimony, of course, you have to be careful not to overdo it. But again, the first person voice can be significant. Sometimes it can be a rhetorical I. Let's imagine in a sermon when I'm doing application, I suddenly, so in my battle with cancer, da-da-da-da. And for a second, people are saying, I didn't know he had cancer. But then the next time, so in my difficult marriage, da-da-da. And then they'll either say, oh, I didn't know he had a difficult marriage and cancer, or they're like, okay, I guess what he's doing is he's projecting himself into the mind of the audience in order to give a variety of examples. And that's another way in which I think the text can come alive in fresh and more powerful ways than the way I wrote it originally, right? And since you've asked me, this is another way that I've learned. At my school, Calvin Theological Seminary, for a number of years recently, I've had a homiletian, a person trained in preaching, come into the class. And so what I did is, in class, we would exegetically, right? We'd make all the hermeneutical moves of going through the interpretation of the passage. I always did that before. But then, after doing that in either one or two classes in detail, I said to the class, okay, I'm going to preach my sermon on this passage. And I said, you're going to be a dangerous audience. You're going to be an audience like you never ever get in the pew, because your audience will never ever hear a sermon that they've spent like a week or two, looking at in detail. But this will put you in a good position to listen to my sermon and say things like, now, what things did we talk about in the preceding weeks, right? That he did leave in the study, right? And he didn't bring to the pulpit. Were there complicated technical, details? Did he ignore them? And was that a good thing or a bad thing? Or did he find a way to summarize them in a very user-friendly way, that the audience could still track, right? I sometimes would ask them, how much time of my sermon was spent in exegesis, the then and there, and how much of the sermon was spent in application, here and now? Most people don't think about that, the balance between what God was saying to the people then and what God is saying through his word now. So anyway, so that was kind of, I think, helpful not only for the students, but now I'm getting to the part where I benefited. So then the homiletician, a person trained in preaching, I would jokingly say, in the chair of despair, and then he would field questions and comments from the students, and we did a debriefing session on my sermon. And that became an occasion for me, to learn also. So, for example, I'll give one specific example so it's more concrete. I was preaching on 1 Thessalonians 4:13 to 18. 1 Thessalonians 4:13 to 18. That passage may be well known to many people because it's one of a couple of key passages in Thessalonians that deals with the end times and specifically with the return of Jesus. And so a lot of people are interested in that passage, but it's also a passage that deals with the death of Christians and the comfort that comes with that. And so a lot of times it's read at funeral services or at the graveside and so forth. So anyway, I prepared with students. We went through, I think, 2 classes in detail, approaching that text grammatically, historically, literarily, theologically, and then it was time for me to preach on that. And I opened this sermon with a rather catchy, interesting, entertaining story having to do with the rapture and the end times. I won't give all of those details. And of course, I got a nice reaction. People were, the students were listening and they laughed at the right point and all of that. But my homiletician colleague pointed out at the end, he did so graciously, he said, well, the thrust of the passage that we did in the exegesis was that Paul in this passage is first and foremost doing what? He's not first and foremost predicting. He's first and foremost pastoring. In other words, the primary purpose of this passage is not to give a blueprint for the future, and to talk about how Jesus will come back, as interesting as that may be. The primary purpose is to provide comfort, right? The verse ends, therefore, comfort one another with these words. And so he said, your opening story, didn't really fit. And I thought to myself, oh, shoot, because I like that story. It's a funny story. I get a good reaction from that story, but I couldn't deny the fact that he made a legitimate point. And so I had to go back to the drawing board. And because I preached it to a class the following year, I threw out that story, right? As much as I loved it, as much as my audience loved it. And instead I came up with a introduction that better fit and set up the stage for that pastoring function that I wanted to stress. So the point I'm saying is, we get feedback from others, and even those of us who've been preaching for a long time, and I guess I could have ignored it. It would have been easy to do, but
you're like, hey, buddy, you're not invited back.
Well, I'm just saying. This is also an instant, that preachers often face. No one would know. I mean, no one in the audience would know. I mean, but this is Paul again, 1 Corinthians 4, right? It's the Lord who judges me, and he knows what's going on in the heart. So out of being faithful to a calling to Christ and to the Word, I felt like, okay, that's really what I ought to have done, and that's what I did. And so anyway, I these are things along the way that you pick up. And then when you write a new sermon, obviously you don't forget those little insights. And then now, instead of learning them the hard way and doing it the second or third time, now when you write a brand new sermon, you can kind of incorporate those insights from the get-go, and your sermon starts off, with better quality from the get-go.
Yeah, so I don't envy the chair of despair. That doesn't sound like it's a lot of fun. And then especially to endure that, in front of the students, and so you've almost you certainly have been the authority up until that point. And then to humbly receive critique in such a way that's going to help them. That's what a great, I'm sure, a memorable learning experience for them.
Well, I mean, I probably wouldn't have done. I didn't do that my first year or second year teaching, So there comes a point where you hopefully become more mature, and all preachers need to do it, because it's impossible to please everyone, and we're not perfect. We can't hit a home run every week, and so I thought this would be a good learning enterprise for the students, and so I wanted them to kind of have a window into this dialogue. I wanted them to hear, how I might respond to their questions and how I might respond to my colleague. But all of us too, I think, should have a heart that we're eager to become better, right? To grow and become more effective proclaimers of the gospel.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to proclaim the gospel here at my own local church, and the elders and I decided a couple months ago that we were going to start the year. It's January at the time of recording this, going through the seven, what's called the seven letters to the seven churches of Revelation. And so I've been trying to do that, to proclaim the gospel week in, week out through those passages. And I have been seeking out coaches and guides and commentaries in that section. I got a lot of recommendations, and then I bought a lot of books. And you want to know my favorite? My favorite is this yellow beauty right here. The Sermons to the Seven Churches of Revelation, a commentary and a guide by Jeffrey Weima. Hey, that's you. So I really enjoyed going through this. This is like risen to the top of the books that I've been consulting. And then also too, there's been a few that I've looked at even after a few weeks that I think they're towards the bottom. I don't know if I'm going to use them very much, but this is my favorite. Anyway, I'm buttering you up now to ask, like, what's the story behind this? How did you come about writing this book? I've heard that it involved 7 men in Ohio. Is that correct?
Well, 7 pastors in Iowa, so close.
My research was faulty.
It is interesting, just to quickly share with your audience, that I'm a Pauline guy. So I'm New Testament, but more narrowly Paul. And I've written 5 books on Paul and lots of articles related to Paul. So this is my first kind of academic writing outside of Paul, and at least substantive. But there's kind of an interesting story, I think interesting. So the germ of it started maybe 12 or 13 years ago when there was a group of pastors in Iowa, and they regularly met. They met, to kind of encourage each other in their ministry. And they knew about me from other contexts, and they said, let's invite Jeff down, right, and have him tell us everything we need to know about the 7 letters of Revelation. And then each of us will write one sermon. We'll divide up the 7 among each of us. And we all live pretty close to each other. And so we'll preach at round robin in each other's congregations. And so that was the idea. And although I had not written or researched these 7 letters at all, I said yes. And the reason I said yes is because I'd already been busy leading biblical tours. I'd led a number of tours to Greece to this point, and I was just ready to expand tours to Turkey. And of course, the 7 churches of Revelation are located all in Western Turkey. And I thought, okay, good. This will do double duty, right? The research I do for these pastors, it'll save me the work I have to do for the presentations I want to do on the tour. So anyway, I went there, and it was a lot of work at the very beginning. And I went there, and I didn't really follow my motto of less is more. I gave them, I'm sure, too much looking back at that. But anyway, their plan didn't quite work out as much as they intended. One of the councils, one of the leaderships of these pastors, I think, thought that this was a kind of an attempt for their pastor to maybe not work as hard as he should have. And they couldn't say that, of course. So they instead said, we think, Pastor, that you're a much better preacher than all those other 6. And we really would love to hear you preach all 7, And so one of these poor pastors had to kind of excuse himself from the group, and he had to do all 7. And then the remaining 6 said, okay, change of plans. We'll all write a sermon on Ephesus, which is the first of the 7. And then we'll do an independent one on one of the remaining 6, and we'll do round robin on that. And so that's how that story ultimately panned out. Then for me, so I had done the research for the pastors, but then I started leading the tours to Turkey. And so I started sharing this with people on the tour. And also I do a fair amount of travel in the Mediterranean, and not just travel, but visiting archaeological sites and doing research on history and geography and culture. And all of that has powerful implications for understanding any of the New Testament writings, but especially and including the book of Revelation. One of the debates of the 7 letters is, are there any what are commonly called local allusions in the 7 letters? In other words, are there specific references to something in Ephesus, in the sermon to Ephesus, and in Smyrna, and so forth? And so I became more and more knowledgeable about, again, the history, archaeology, culture, geography, and then I started entering into that debate, saying yes or no to some of those questions. And then, on top of that, I also lead these seminars, sometimes for lay people, sometimes for pastors. I lead 1 or 2 day preaching seminars, and so I added this to my repertoire. I've got a couple of different topics, and so I started leading seminars on the 7 letters or sermons, as I'll have a chance hopefully to explain. And then finally I got to the point I'm like, well, I'm preaching all the time, and I need some new material to preach on, and I'm teaching pastors to preach on this. It's kind of silly that I'm not. And so then I started preaching sermons on the 7 sermons. And then in the meantime, I finally finished my magnum opus, my 711-page commentary on 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. And I finished a user-friendly book on Paul, and my slate was clean. And then the publisher said, what would you like to do next? And I said, I've kind of done all this work on the 7 letters. I think that would be a good project. And so that's finally how it came together. And I wrote it not fast, but wrote it relatively quickly because, as I hope you're starting to understand, there's kind of a long track record, right? The material has been beta tested, we would used to say, not just academically, but also pastorally, and so I think that the product at the end is of better quality than if I had just written it, let's say, 10 years ago, let's say after doing the seminar with the pastors.
Well, it's got a long and storied history, and it's arrived across my desk, and I was enjoying it. And then this is what I do sometimes. I'm enjoying a book. I check the back, and then I say, "Hey, is this author still alive?" And then the next thing is, "Hey, do I know anybody at Baker Academic?" And then I shoot off an email and I say, "Hey, I'd love to speak with this author," because selfishly and greedily, this helps me and my ministry. And then I believe and I trust that through this podcast, it's going to help other teachers and preachers and students. But like first and foremost, I'm just greedily, I want to talk to you. So here I am, and other people get to listen in on it. So that's wonderful. I'm glad you're still alive. Keep on exercising, keep eating healthy, because we need more of this stuff from you in the future.
Well, thank you. I am working hard, to stay healthy and well. It's hard to fight age, but the Lord willing, I'm planning to be involved in writing and research and preaching and teaching for a while. I might just say, because again, most in the audience may not know the book, it's important for them to know that the book reflects that trajectory I just shared. In other words, that about 2/3 of each chapter are exegesis, a rather detailed but somewhat user-friendly explanation of what the text meant, right? And so forth. But what I think is also kind of unique about the book is the last third, written in a different font and with a shaded background to kind of set it apart, is my own sermon on each of the 7 letters or 7 sermons. And even for me, they're fairly heavily exegetical sermons. But, on the other hand, you can see, because I've added hopefully a catchy introduction and I've done some application at the end. And you could see, too, again, what things I left in the study, right? What things were left in the first 2/3 of the chapter under exegesis and didn't make it to the pulpit, didn't make it to the sermon. And so the book hopefully models, it not only equips a pastor to teach or to preach on this material. I shouldn't say just pastors, because it's good for teachers, too. But it kind of models that move from the study to the pulpit. And I don't think a lot of academic books do that, right? And then so you end up with either academics writing on any book of the Bible, including Revelation, and it's often good, but they haven't thought carefully or helped the reader much. And how do you translate it to a modern audience? And then I've met a number of contemporary preachers, who are good communicators and come up with good analogies and applications. But their exegesis isn't always so solid. Their explanation of the text isn't always so reliable. So because of my history, I'm trying to bridge the gap then between the academy and the pew. And I think that book does it in a way that not many do anyway, at least in the book, not many dealing with the book of Revelation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you took the words out of my mouth, because you said earlier on, as you were talking about in your growth since your early days, you learned that not everything needs to make its way into the final sermon. And that's exactly what's modeled in this book. The sermon is based on the previous exegetical work, but it is a summarized version of it, and that's what our people need. They don't need to know the history or the various ways that Nika or Nika can mean victory or all the derivatives of that. They just need to know the big idea, and it's a helpful thing. It reminds me of the NIV application commentary series, which has maybe a similar process to it. They have also a bridging gaps section in between that kind of shows the parallels, and then it goes into the actual preaching thing itself. But I haven't seen too much like this, and it's a very useful, it's a gift to us who are trying to understand the passage and then communicate it well. You're modeling it for us.
Good. Well, thank you. That's right. That's right. That was kind of a genre breaking, right? It's a different kind of commentary, that application series, which has now already come out a few years ago. But your audience may not realize it, but in the academy, where I hang out, until recently, it was considered not important or valued to kind of speak to the population. In fact, I remember there was a younger female scholar who published something in BAR, Biblical Archaeological Review. It's a popular magazine. And anyway, one of her colleagues said, if you don't want tenure, just keep on publishing articles like that. In other words, there's a strong bias against communicating to the broader church. Now, thankfully, that's changed because of people like Tom Wright, Marcus Borg. Some of them are not always so conservative, but these are good communicators who've kind of paved the way and said, wait a minute, the larger church needs to have access to this material too. And anyway, so that's kind of a more recent change or transition within the academy to kind of bridge the gap again between the academy and the pew.
Yeah, well, hey, as a representative of the little guy, thanks for remembering us. Thanks for including us in this. I appreciate it. Now, I know that you are, as you mentioned earlier on, like you're mostly kind of a New Testament, kind of a Pauline letter guy, the letters of Paul particularly. Now, many people refer to Revelation 2 and 3 as the 7 letters of Jesus to the church, but not you. It seems that you probably understand what a letter is more than most, and yet you consciously choose to not call it a letter. Do you have a minute or two to explain why you're referring to this as a sermon versus a letter?
Of course. So on the one hand, that phrase, the 7 letters, is well entrenched, and I'm not against a pastor or using it, maybe just not to confuse people. So, but on the other hand, I do know something about letters, and my 5th book was called Paul the Ancient Letter Writer, in which I stress very much the form and structure of Paul's letters and how that's really crucial for interpretation. And so you can understand, therefore, when I came to the 7 so-called letters, it was clear to me that actually, one, the text never calls them letters, right? So people shouldn't be upset if I question that. It's not like I'm questioning the Bible itself. So don't claim more than the Bible claims. So they don't claim to be letters. And furthermore, they actually have virtually nothing in them that are letter-like. And I'm not the only person to notice that. There are a number of commentators who have said exactly the same thing. So anyway, that was important for me. And so it was important enough that I said, okay, I'm going to go against the grain, even though maybe it might be confusing for some. I'm going to talk about the 7 sermons instead of the 7 letters. Now, having said that they're not letters, though, doesn't mean that they don't have a structure. They just don't have an epistolary structure, but they very clearly have an outline or structure to them. And just like knowing the letter structure is important for understanding Paul and New Testament letters, so also the structure of the 7 sermons is crucial. Because when there are changes in that outline or structure, that's not by accident or fluke chance. So, for example, normally the second thing in every letter is what I call the commendation. Jesus gives a kind of thumbs up to the church. He says something that they're doing good. However, when you get to, Sermon 5, Sardis, and they've been listening to 1, 2, 3, 4, right? And Jesus always starts off by saying something positive and good. And so I can anticipate them sitting there, okay, Jesus, what's the good thing you're going to say for us? And then, the words that come out of his mouth are, wait a minute, you are dead, right? You're dying. And so the reader ought to pick up, and I'm afraid if you don't know the structure, you'll miss it. The reader ought to pick up that Jesus judges the situation in Sardis so serious that he can't bring himself to say anything positive about it. Normally the Bible is important for what it says. There are occasions, and this is one of them, where the Bible is important for what it doesn't say, right? And so, anyway, there are other ways in which, if I had time, I could stress the fact that knowing the structure or outline of each of the sermons is important. So, yes, they're not letters, Yes, I won't think you're a heretic. I won't hate you if you're a preacher and you keep using the title, The Seven Letters. But it is important for you at least to know, and you can decide whether you want to change the title to sermons or not, right? But it is important to know that they're not letters, but nevertheless have a structure, and that knowing and following that structure in your interpretation exegesis is an important part of getting those sermons right.
Yeah, I have a parallel Bible right here at my desk. King James calls it the message to the church in Ephesus, NIV to the church in Ephesus, the message. Everyone calls it the message. It's just a bit of, I don't know, preacher shorthand that has gotten into common vocabulary. But is it a hill to die on? Probably not. But again, I'm talking to somebody who's put a lot of thought into it, and I certainly want to hear from the horse's mouth why you're referring to that. Now here's a follow-up question. So if these are sermons from Jesus, and if we are talking to an audience of preachers, what can or should we learn about, how does Jesus preach? How does the resurrected Jesus preach? And how can that impact the way that we should be preachers as well?
Well, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with that question, I'm afraid, because you're asking a question that the text is not intending to answer. Now, that happens a number of times in life. There are a number of questions we have that the Bible is not intending to answer. So it doesn't mean it's not a good question, but it does raise some concerns that, one, if the Bible doesn't answer that question, we shouldn't be frustrated with the Bible because, it's not, it's like you're asking it to do something that it's saying, well, I'm not doing that, right? So don't fault me. And so the only hesitation I have is, I don't see any exhortations in the Bible say, preach the way Jesus did or something like that. Now, on the other hand, in Philippians 2, the life of Jesus is held up as a model to follow, his humility, his humbleness, his obedience, and so forth. And so there is a place for the imitatio Christi, the imitation of Christ. So don't get me wrong. And it may be that when we look at the preaching of Jesus or the preaching of Paul or anyone, right, that we can learn some insights as long as they're confirmed by other passages of Scripture, I think, that explicitly exhort us to do that. But here's let me get at it this way. There was a leadership guy, I'll just say, I don't want to give his name away, who wrote a book a number of years ago, and he modeled all these different kinds of leadership on different periods of history in the Bible. And I remember reading his book, and he actually came and spoke at our seminary, and he invited us into the groups, and we had to say, now, would you want to be a leader under the King's age, or would you be a leader under the Gospel age, or whatever, and I'm like, well, I'm a little uncomfortable with this exercise because the purpose of the Bible is not to kind of give that. And what's more, he talked about finishing leadership strong, the end of your life, finishing strong. And he held up the example of Paul. And I said, well, wait a minute, Paul and Barnabas, they did have a conflict earlier in life. And what about that? Is that a model for leadership? So anyway, I'm maybe going on a little too long on that, but I'm just saying one ought to be cautious about looking to Jesus as a model for, yes, as a model for us to live the Christian life, but as preachers. Now, having said that, I could say that there are some dangers about preaching these seven letters, if I could say something about that, unless I'm going on too long. And they relate
no such
to this.
thing. No,
okay.
Podcasts are long form. You talk until you're done, sir.
So one. Okay, I'll start with the more negative one. Well, they're both dangers, so I guess they're both negative. This relates to Jesus. There's a note of judgment in the seven sermons that is quite strong, and that typically the modern audience doesn't really like, because people today don't like a judging Jesus. They like a soft and gentle Jesus, the kind of Jesus, who's got children on his lap and lambs running around in the background. And they don't like a Jesus who's got not just a sword, but a sharp double-edged sword. And what's more, it's coming out of his mouth. So this isn't felt as strongly when you stretch out over 7 or 8 weeks. But, it's interesting. I felt it myself when I've done intensive teaching in 1 or 2 days, this note of judgment is felt to a greater degree. And so I guess my exhortation for pastors is to know this up front. And so as you're working through the 7 sermons, make sure that you emphasize grace, right, wherever you can, and maybe highlight it so that the note of judgment isn't overshadowed. So, for example, when you get to sermon number 7, and there are a number of things that show that the sermon to Laodicea is the worst. There's no commendation, and what's more, the complaint is longer than any other complaint that Jesus has, and the language is very vivid. The Greek text, it isn't found in almost any translation, but Jesus says, I'm going to spit you out of my mouth. Actually, there's an old-fashioned English word, spew you out of your mouth, which in colloquial language is, Jesus said, I'm about to vomit you out of my mouth. And the Greek text clearly uses that verb for vomiting. And so it's a very violent reaction. So there are all kinds of clues. There's no commendation, no thumbs up. There's a long complaint, and the complaint involves quite strong language. These are the worst of the churches, that is, the church of Laodicea. And then we get to the end of the sermon, and if you know the structure, there's first a negative consequence and then a positive one. So the negative consequence, I'm like bracing myself because all the other sermons have a pretty strong judgment. Like Jesus has some pretty harsh consequences for these other churches, which weren't near as bad as Laodicea. And so I'm saying if you're following the structure, it's like brace yourself, strap yourself in. I mean, because this is going to be bad. And then you get to the negative consequence, and we read something like, behold, I stand at the door and knock. And if anyone opens the door, I will come in and eat with him and him with me. And you're like, what? I didn't see that coming. I mean, I was expecting, these aren't words of judgment. These are words of grace, right? And actually the text says, those whom I love, I rebuke. I know that people don't, our kids, our parents said that to us as kids, and we sometimes say that, this is going to hurt me more than it hurts you. But actually, there's truth to it, right? The discipline comes with love. So if you know that there's already a strong note of judgment in the 7 sermons, you want to highlight the fact that this is a message out of love, as bad as they are. And notice that Jesus says, I want to stand in the door and knock. And you have to realize at the beginning of the sermon, Jesus has introduced himself as the ruler of God's creation. The rulers have all kinds of power. Jesus has more than enough power over all creation. He doesn't need to stand at the door and in a wussy way knock. I mean, he can just blow the door. He can do whatever he wants. And Jesus is like the sad sack boyfriend who's been dumped by his beloved, and he still stands at the door with a bouquet of flowers and knocking, saying, please, please. And I would want the reader, and if I were preaching, I would want the hearer to capture the powerful note of grace, that it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what you've done. You can live a life so bad that it makes Jesus want to puke, and yet he still loves you. He still cares for you. He still wants a relationship with you. And so this is, in this little thing I've been talking about, this is both an illustration of knowing the structure and how the change in the structure is benefit, but it also is trying to say, now, there's more than enough judgment in the 7 sermons. Make sure that you don't miss or downplay the note of grace. All right, so that's one word of warning. I mean, it relates to your question, because if you say, well, what kind of preaching did Jesus have? I say, well, it was pretty strong, right? He didn't pull punches, in these 7 sermons. Now, a second part to this answer is, I have to be careful how to word this. There's kind of this, how shall I say it? This idea that the pastor is going to come in now and this mysterious, intimidating, scary book of Revelation, you can give thanks to God, congregation, that I'm here to explain to you what it means. He won't say it. You won't say it this way, but some of us have known about the danger of Gnosticism. Gnosticism is a Greek word on knowledge, and the idea that somehow certain people are privileged to secret knowledge, and the knowledge is the way to salvation. There's a danger in presenting the 7 sermons like, wait a minute, you poor people will never get it. But again, good thing I came along, and I'm the big revealer who will give you these truths. And you go, oh, wow.
Yeah.
And so, and I have the same with leading tours. It goes one step further, for those, I've been there, and I can tell you what it really means, these symbols and so forth. And so there's a call for humbleness here. Be careful that you don't preach or teach it in a way that your audience feels marginalized or distant. So, so I've said enough, and I'll give you a chance here to respond to these two answers that maybe you didn't quite expect to the question, what kind of preacher was Jesus?
No, I mean, I realize it's a tricky question. And so I've heard some people really even very simplistically say, well, we learned from Jesus here, it's important to give, a critique sandwich. When we're given feedback, make sure that we say positive and then also negative and then positive again. And so I've heard that, and that feels rather trite. And I wasn't expecting something trite from you. And so thank you for that big, broad, thoughtful, concern, or again. And he is, you mentioned that we look to him, we looked at him as like the author and finisher of our faith, not so much kind of like the role model in how to preach. I think we can learn certain things from his communication style, use of illustrations or whatever, but ultimately he's the one we preach about, not the one that we necessarily mimic his unique style.
Right, and because some things are cross-cultural that Jesus does, but some things are not. I mean, Jesus is preaching to a lower class, Jewish audience, and he can assume a lot of things about that, right? That the preacher today cannot. I mean, I'm not preaching always to lower class. I certainly are preaching to people who don't know the Old Testament or the custom, So there are all kinds of ways you have to be cautious, right? If you're going to use Jesus as a model, because if Jesus came today to preach, I'm sure his sermons would be a little different, right? They would be adapted to fit the specific context of our time and our age.
Yeah. Okay. Now, you mentioned that there's in these messages, there is a strong current of judgment. And of course, as you mentioned, there's notes of grace throughout again and again and again. And we do well to highlight them. I visited a church's retreat. This is going back so many years ago. This is in Dublin. And they were going through the 8 churches. It was the message from Jesus to the 8 churches. And the first 7 were these ones. And then the 8th, maybe you can guess it, it was that Dublin church. And the preacher on this retreat was saying, this is what Jesus wants to say about our church. And, it continued through with that theme of judgment that you mentioned, but it was definitely lacking even those notes of grace. It was essentially a rant about how people aren't volunteering enough and they're not respecting their pastor enough. I mentioned that just as a cringe-worthy example of missing that grace, and then also weaponizing it to get more volunteers to put out chairs, and then also get a bit more respect for himself. It was the worst thing I've ever sat through, to be honest. Do you recommend that we also have an 8th church and have a message allegedly from Jesus to our congregations?
No, because somehow it also implies, or it seems to send a bit of a message that the other 7 aren't to our church. It's only this 8th one that is, right? And so a couple of things. One, the fact that there are 7 churches, 7 is clear. Well, first of all, it's the book of Revelation is apocalyptic, and one of the features of apocalyptic is, the use of numbers in a more metaphorical or symbolic way. And we know there were other churches in Asia Minor, right? Because Colossae is located just down the street, just down the river or just down the Lycus Valley from Laodicea, and Hierapolis is across the other side. And we know there were churches there, right? And so forth, because we have the letter to Colossians and the letter to Philemon. And so the 7 are kind of picked, kind of representing the church as a whole. And it's clear that the message to Ephesus is not just Ephesus. Yes, it has a particular message and emphasis for them, but Jesus expects the other Christians in Asia Minor and elsewhere to be listening in, right, on their mail, so to say, or on their sermon. And the degree to which it is relevant for them, it also needs to be applied. And that's the way that we should treat it today. I mean, in my mind, the book of Revelation should be exegeted, interpreted the same as, say, the letters of Paul, right? Paul's letters were written to let's take Corinthians, for example, right? When Paul wrote the Corinthians, he wasn't thinking about 21st century Christians. He was thinking about that congregation in Corinth that he founded, right? He led them to Christ. He was there for a year and a half, and they had specific issues, and Paul responds to the letter that they wrote to him and what he learns about them. Now, though that letter, even though it has a very particular message first and foremost to them, it has implications for God's will for us today. And in a very similar way, when we get to, say, the sermon or the letter to the Ephesians in the book of Revelation, right? It has a particular audience and a particular situation in mind, and we first discover what that is, and then we think about its implications for today. And in some churches, its implications will be more direct and immediate than others, right? So, for instance, the church, I call the church of Ephesus the church of loveless orthodoxy. Loveless orthodoxy. And so it seems to be a church that is commended for orthodoxy. Orthodoxy is a good thing, right? Churches and Christians should know the truth and speak the truth and defend the truth. Yay, that's a good thing. But sometimes, too much of a good thing is not a good thing. And so if that describes you as an individual Christian, and if that describes our congregation, then we need to hear what the Spirit was saying to the churches, plural, right? Not just the church of Ephesus, not just the other churches of the ancient world, but the church today. And so then we apply it there. So then we go on to another congregation, right? And like Pergamum, it deals with meat sacrificed to idols. And if you understand that properly, it really is dealing with idolatry. And I would argue that the sin of idolatry is a big challenge for almost any congregation today. And so the idols are different, and the way we worship those idols are different, but the sin of idolatry is every bit a problem and a temptation today as it was then. And so again, the message is first and foremost for Pergamum and their situation, but then we apply it to the degree that it's relevant to us today. And so I would argue that all seven are applicable today, and it's a bit misleading to somehow come up with an imaginary eighth where you can slot in maybe all the things, that you say, oh, this is my chance to rebuke the church on this, or this is my chance to encourage giving, by slipping this in. And so there's no need for that. It's a misuse of Scripture. And these passages, well, again, let me just say it this way, because I haven't said this yet in our conversation. I think that a lot of people treat Revelation the way I did, okay? And maybe not, but I'm pretty sure it's the case, because I found a quote from Craig Keener, another good egghead scholar, who said exactly the same thing. So I looked at Revelation as written to like super Christians. These are like the people who are following Jesus to the max, even though there's opposition, and some of them are even dying, and that made the book of Revelation not relevant, frankly, for me, at least in my part of the world, because where I live in North America, I'm not under persecution. I'm not facing death. And so the book was distant for me because of its weird images and metaphors, and it didn't seem relevant to my life. And what I discovered very quickly is that actually, instead of these seven congregations being super Christians, actually, they're not. They're weak Christians. The majority of them, there are two exceptions of the seven, but the majority of these churches are compromising their faith. And that describes what I see a lot of the Western church. Now, it's not true of Christians in Asia and so forth, right, who are marginalized and facing opposition for their faith. But for many of us, we're kind of wanting the gospel and the world, right? And we're saying, what can we do to still hang on to the idols of this world, but yet also not give up God and Jesus? And so why this is important is suddenly now these seven letters or sermons which I thought were remote and distant from my situation in my day, were suddenly extremely relevant. And so it made me very excited about teaching them and preaching them. And I hope that you found that out too in the middle of your series, that this is very relevant stuff that is easily applicable for Jesus followers today.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, so far so good. We're only a few weeks into it, but it's going well so far. Some feedback that I've gotten, and I wanted to ask your thoughts on this, is people have come to me and said, are we going to continue on through Revelation? Will we do chapter 4, 5, 6, all the way up to 20, 21, 22, 22? Oops. And I've disappointed everybody by saying, no, we're gonna stop at the end of chapter 3 and then move into a series on 1 Corinthians. And I'll probably get back in touch with you once we start our Corinthians series, if you have any more coaching you can give about Corinthians. But do you have kind of is there an apologia? Is there a reason why you think it's okay to do just this section and not the whole thing?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good and somewhat tricky question for me, because I want to say yes and no, So in principle, right, in approaching Scripture, I always stress with students, it's very important to begin at the right spot and end at the right spot. In other words, you have to have what I sometimes call a legitimate preaching or teaching unit. And it's important for your audience to remember that the chapters in our Bible are not original to the text, right? They were added in about the 11th century, and the verses were added even later than that. So if you preach chapter by chapter, you're not really following the intent of the author. Some of the chapter divisions are okay, but a lot of them are artificially made. And so I always say it's really important to make sure you know the literary unit to which your passage belongs. Now, you can preach on a section within that unit, but it's still important for you to know the unit that at which it belongs. So, for example, to go to another part of Scripture, take spiritual gifts. No, not the better one. Take the chapter of love, chapter 13 of 1 Corinthians, right? Okay, the love chapter, right?
Yeah, you just dodged a complicated subject.
No, I'm going to still bring it in. But
okay.
Anyway, chapter 13 of 1 Corinthians was not put in there to give preachers a text to use for weddings, No, actually, it's really crucial to see that chapter 13 is in the center of a unit that begins earlier in 12 and ends in 14. What's in 12 and 14? Both of them deal with spiritual gifts, and more particularly the gift of tongues versus prophecy. And Paul has deliberately included chapter 13 with love in the middle of that discussion. And so that's an example of how, whether you're preaching anywhere on 12, 13, and 14, you need to know that larger unit of which that belongs. And so in principle, I want to stress how important it is to know where the legitimate beginning and ending of any unit is. Now, getting to the 7 letters or the 7 sermons, they are a separate unit. Okay, there are clues within the text that mark it out beginning and ending, namely chapters 2 and 3. But nevertheless, it is important to know that it's part of a larger text, namely the book of Revelation. And you will know a little bit, since you've worked through my book already, that all of the Christ titles, so every sermon begins with a Christ title, all of them, with minor exceptions, come from chapter 1. So John, under the leading of the Holy Spirit, kind of reaches back to the first chapter. So those descriptions of Jesus holding the 7 stars, or I mentioned earlier, the sharp double-edged sword, all of those images come out of chapter 1 and the vision of Jesus in chapter 1, 9 to 20. And so it's important to make those connections. And there are also links between, not surprisingly, because the book of Revelation is written by a good author, that there are links between the 7 letters and the rest of Revelation, right? Now, I'm saying yes and no. I'm saying yes, it's important to know that it's part of the whole book of Revelation, but you can still preach on a unit within that beginning and end as long as it's a legitimate unit. So I think that there may be practical reasons, not to go on and have another series on all the book of Revelation, because it does get kind of long and unwieldy after a while, right? And maybe you can do that at another time. Or maybe you can do a superficial treatment of the major units, right? So once you've done a detailed study of the 7 sermons or letters, right? Maybe a year or two later you say, okay, I'm just going to have one sermon reminding you of what all 7, and then you go on to the other unit so that your hearers see how it fits within the book as a whole. So I do think that if you're preaching a series, if there are pastors, right, why not have 8-week series and have the first week being Revelation 1? Because that will give you a chance, because in Revelation 1, we find out that John's on the island of Patmos, and it probably would be helpful for your audience to know, well, why is he on the island of Patmos? Is it for evangelism reasons? Is it persecution reasons? Or is it something else? And what's the island of Patmos like? It's not really a modern day Alcatraz, okay? And also the links, you might have a chance to preach on the vision of Jesus, so that when you get to those echoes in the next following weeks, people will have some familiarity with it. So I do think that you could do a 7-week and just start with Ephesians. That's okay. But another way to do it is to have an 8-week series and have the first week in chapter 1 kind of setting the stage for what is to come and the context, and then going through all 7. So those are at least a couple of comments in response to the question about how to preach it and how it fits with the rest of the book.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I like what you're saying, because that's what we're doing. Yeah. We're doing an 8-week. We did, it was on, Sunday, January 1st. So we did chapter 1 kind of in one go, seeing the real Jesus in 2023, and then different graphics and everything. And then chapter 7, we kind of introduced even a new series title and a new, as if it was kind of its own series, but it's based on that. Also, attendance was so dismal on January 1st. I'm like, okay, I'm glad that I didn't I don't want to say waste Ephesians 1, or sorry, the Ephesians letter on this. I'm glad that we kind of waited until attendance kind of ebbed back to what it is. Anyway, that's a whole other issue. I'm looking at the clock. How much more time do you have? I don't want to, you could talk about this all day and I could listen all day, but what does your schedule allow? And
well, maybe you can pick one last question that you really are eager to ask, and then we can call it a day, and we can always have a follow-up discussion sometime down the road on this or another subject.
Once I get to the letter of Paul, then maybe I'll get back in touch. Okay, let's park Revelation. Lastly, I want to talk to you as a communicator, as a Bible teacher, as a preacher. How are you currently trying to improve as a Bible teacher? How would you like to finish this year as a better preacher?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I've answered that a little bit already, in the sense that, one, there's a kind of self-reflection on my own sermons, right? Remember my comment earlier about how when I would re-preach a sermon, I would say, now, why did I make that change, or so forth? So I tried to be more conscious and deliberate about that, so that I could kind of identify changes and strategies that I would implement then, in the first draft of the next sermon. So that's one thing. Also, I try to solicit feedback. Sometimes people are reluctant to offer criticism, either because I'm perceived as the egghead theologian, or we're more and more in a culture where people don't want to be offensive and so forth. But I try to find somebody who's confident enough, and I have a good relationship with, that they can offer some feedback, right? So I think that's important.
Not the chair of despair again.
No, not the chair of despair. No.
Okay,
that's right. But I mean, I encourage people to be frank, be honest, right? I mean, of course, I'm hoping that involves some affirmation, because we all need to be encouraged. But I had that with my wife too. Was there a spot where all kinds of things can be improved? 3, sometimes, I'll accept a preaching assignment on a text that maybe, I'm not excited about, but it'll force me to kind of wrestle with a different genre of scripture, or maybe even a difficult passage. It's a good question to raise. So, I'm familiar with Paul and his letters, and my sermons can be nice and logical and deductive. But what about Hebrew poetry, right? I mean, should a sermon on a psalm have the same kind of structure or outline that a Pauline letter has, right? And sometimes to experiment with different models like narrative preaching, right? I think that narrative preaching has become popular recently. By that I mean you kind of retell the story. And there are some dangers. Some of the dangers are you just retell it in a superficial way. Sometimes I ask my wife, because I don't trust my own judgment, she says, well, I kind of knew that already, right? So I'm not talking about retelling the story with nothing fresh or insight. Now, if you add new details, there's also dangers, because sometimes people, they don't know enough about the first century. I'm picking a New Testament text. They don't know enough about the ancient world, the Roman world, that when they add stuff that I would judge as non-historical, right? They create situations or scenarios that have no basis in reality. So I sometimes want to draw on my knowledge of the history, culture of the ancient world in order to retell a story, right, in a truly new and fresh way, that not only have new details, but maybe the message of the text comes out. So those are at least some of the things that I do. But remember, my full-time job is supposed to be a teacher, and right. This preaching's a side job, if you will. But of course, it is a big part of what I do, because I think it keeps me fresh in the classroom. I'm teaching not undergraduate students, but I'm teaching people who are thinking about ministry. And by me being in the pulpit, that gets me out in the church, and I think it puts me in a better position to kind of know what expectations are, right? For example, the three criteria typically that people use to judge a good sermon are not very healthy. One is, how long is the sermon, right? So I have a motto, right? The longer I am, the better I'd better be. And it takes a second, right, for it to sink in. The longer I am, the better I'd better be. So if I'm going to be long, I better be on the top of my game, right? So, and that's true for podcasts too, by the way. Notice how I wanted to bring it to a close. Secondly, you have to be interesting and preferably funny. Okay, because no one likes a boring speaker, and there's some pressure to say something that's humorous. And then thirdly, it has to be relevant. It has to, people want to take something home with them and so forth. Now, in principle, I don't want to be long, and I do want to be interesting and preferably funny, and I do want to be practical. But notice I could preach a short sermon that people would find quite captivating, and I could even give them 3 steps to take home, and I've never once said how faithful was the sermon to the text, right? How accurate did it reflect the teaching of the word? And so I guess I wanted to put a plug in there, right? Because I don't know about your audience, but some of your audience are facing those same pressures that I'm facing, right? To be short, funny, and relevant. And they want to jump too quickly to the here and now. And I want everyone to slow down and focus on the then and there, right, of the text. So a little exhortation to not only your readers, but again to myself, right, to not shortchange the exegetical process in the preaching of the word.
Solid aspirational goals for yourself and for all of us as well. Thank you so much for letting us in on that. And thank you for making time for this conversation. And I will include in the show notes, there'll be links where people can get the Revelation book, as well as the other tomes that you have been written, as well as links to, is it jeffreyweima.com? And I'll make sure there's resources. All these things that have been listed will be accessible and available to the people. Appreciate your ministry. Appreciate your writing. Maybe one day I'd love to go on a tour with you in one of these Bible lands and learn more from you myself. But in the meanwhile, I'm thankful for the books and for this conversation. And for the listeners of this podcast, I hope that this episode and all that we do at Expositors Collective helps you to grow in your personal study and public proclamation of God's Word. Thanks, Jeff. All right. Thanks again, Dr. Weima. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for making time to talk with me. And I look forward to having you on again to talk about the letters of Paul. So for those that are planning on registering for our Austin event, The link is in the show notes, or you can go to expositorscollective.com to find out more about the schedule and the speakers. Next week is a real continuation of this theme, because I actually am interviewing another author whose book I was reading for a sermon prep, and I reached out to him and I invited him onto the show. Next Tuesday is Jeremy Ripoll talking about his book, which is called Pastor, Jesus is Enough. He actually is unpackaging the 7 messages of Jesus to the Church of Revelation as well, but from much more of a devotional and encouraging message to burnt out church leaders. So if that's you, or if that could be you in the future, make sure that you're subscribed so that this automatically comes to your device next Tuesday. We believe that Jesus has words of encouragement to burnt out church leaders. I hope that this episode and next episode and our training events, that all of them work together to help you grow in your personal study and public proclamation of God's Word. God bless you.